Hey guys, welcome for another episode of The Suited Shootist. And today, as the thumbnail and the video title would suggest, we're talking about comfortable guns. Before I jump into it, real quick, just a couple things. Number one, I've still got stickers left, so if you want some of these for your ammo cans or laptops or whatever else, go ahead and in the description below, I've got the details on how to pick those up. So definitely snag them because they're going quickly. Secondly, if you're getting a lot of value out of the channel and you are so inclined, I do have a Patreon going now at this point with a couple different tiers and some different levels of access. So the link to that is down there as well. I would greatly appreciate if you signed up on that also. So thank you so much for those that already have. Last thing, real quick, I get I'm not for everybody. If you are going to give the video a thumbs down, totally cool. Doesn't hurt my feelings. At the very least, let me know what I'm doing wrong, because I'm always interested in the areas that I can improve. So if you don't dig what I'm doing, please let me know what I can do to make it more relevant for you. Aside from that, let's go ahead and jump into it. If you've been following me for any level of time, you know that language is important to me. And so what I want to touch on is not necessarily so much the exact expression, but the sentiment that's behind it these days. There's a lot of online discussion where very flippantly or very dismissively somebody will invoke, well, carrying a gun should be comforting, not comfortable. And just like with the idea of dressing around the gun, or just like the idea that it works for me, at best, it's an incomplete thought. So what I wanted to do is dig into it a little bit, because while the statement has some merit, if you understand its background and you put some critical thought into it, on its surface, delivered in just that fashion, I'm not the biggest fan of it. So let's start with a little bit of the historical context. Carrying a gun is supposed to be comforting, not comfortable, originated with Clint Smith. And from an exchange that I had with Carl Wren, my understanding is that it was delivered in the early 90s to one of his pistol classes. Something to keep in mind is that in the early 90s and the decades prior, there were really only two major categories of handguns. For the most part, all serious users were running full-size duty guns like this Beretta 92 or an equivalent, K-frame size revolver. This was what you saw cops and military of the era carrying on their duty belts. This was considered the serious work gun, which is fine. But here's the thing. That's not necessarily conducive to the armed lifestyle for the average civilian. There's always some kind of compromise that's going to be made. At that point in time, the only other options that really existed were tiny little mouse guns, little pocket guns in 32, 380, or God forbid 25 ACP. So the disparity between acceptable and functional and grotesque compromise in performance was a pretty big span. The only real happy medium that existed, at least to my knowledge at that point, aside from like the Glock 26, which is still fairly a substantial gun, the happy medium of the era was the J-frame. And this was the case for a long time. But here we are in 2021, and we now have a plethora of options at our disposal. Everything from the single stack Glocks like the 48 and the 43 to the Smith & Wesson Shield and Shield Plus to the SIG P365 and the XL variant of the same. There's a lot more in the last several years that's been done to bridge that gap where you can still have appropriately serviceable handguns in much more user-friendly platforms. But it's not necessarily just a gear consideration. That's part of it. But my real issue is kind of with the sentiment with which that statement tends to be delivered by the general public. Because while I've never had the privilege of dealing with Clint Smith directly, some of the folks that I've spoken to that have told me that, I mean, he is well respected and an icon within the industry for a reason. The guy is not only a font of knowledge, but he's an incredibly deep thinker when it comes to this whole thing. The people that typically just spit out carrying a gun is supposed to be comforting, not comfortable, are just addressing it at such a superficial level that I think it does it disservice. For a couple of reasons. Number one, it doesn't necessarily address the pain point, to kind of use some of my familiar sales terminology. Somebody has a problem that they are trying to rectify, and the verbiage that they're using may not actually be the truest definition of the problem. It's just their best ability to articulate the issue, because there's a wide spectrum of discomfort. When I go to jiu-jitsu and I am getting my ass beat and I'm getting smashed time after time after time, it's uncomfortable, but it's beneficial, because it's one of those things where it is forging me into a more resilient person. The same token, if I go to pull something off of my grill that's at 375 degrees and I try and do that with my bare hands, that's also uncomfortable. But there's no upside to that. All I'm doing is causing myself damage. So it's critical to understand, if somebody is articulating, oh, well, this is uncomfortable, to really dig down and understand what it is that they mean. Is it that the fact that they've got a holster that's creating a hot spot that is easily rectified by repositioning it or adding something like a foam wedge? Or is it somebody who is trying to shoehorn an inappropriately large firearm onto their frame because they've been berated into believing that unless you're carrying a Glock 34, you don't take your self-defense seriously? There's the two sides of the spectrum. And so that's why it's critical to really understand the distinction, because in and of itself, as a standalone thought, it doesn't really dig into the challenges that a lot of people have. For new folks, the idea of carrying a gun in any capacity is so foreign to them that strapping this pound-and-a-half hunk of metal onto their belt line is going to feel, at best, abnormal. It may not be causing them pain necessarily, but you know, it's kind of like walking around with a rock in your shoe. Yeah, it's not damaging you, but it's kind of a pain in the ass. And what I dislike about the delivery of this, the way it seems to be applied these days, is it's so dismissive that it basically just communicates, nah, whatever you're going through, either you're doing it wrong or it doesn't matter, just suck it up and deal with it. As opposed to, you know what, there's so many people that have been through that before, let's dig into it, figure exactly what it is that you're having challenges with, and see how we can work it to be as compatible and as cohesive a system as possible. Because that's what matters. If somebody is having such a challenge with incorporating their defensive tools into their normal lifestyle, unless they are truly dedicated, or unless they just get it right out of the gate, a lot of folks are just inclined to say, okay, I guess this isn't for me. I managed to get this far without carrying a gun, I should be okay. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not, but to deny that experience, I'm not a fan of it. Because, again, especially with the influx of new gun owners that we've got, and on a daily basis on a couple of the Facebook groups that I'm in, some of these folks are legitimately first-time gun buyers, and some of these folks have been gun owners for a while, but they're just starting to really dive into the deep end of personal protection. Regardless of which of those camps you're dealing with, you want to make sure that you're meeting them where they're at, and you're not creating these artificial barriers to entry. Because the last thing that you want to do is be demeaning about it, or, you know, make them feel stupid because they haven't figured it out yet. The other thing that really amuses me about this whole thing, and it's a bit of an aside, but it's also the reason that I chose to dress the way that I am for this video. You know, t-shirt, hoodie, and joggers. Yeah, it's comfortable. You know, if I'm just kicking around the house, or I just got to run down to the corner store for whatever, you probably catch me in this. But this it's an interesting trend that I've seen. The same people that will insist that carrying a gun is supposed to be comforting, not comfortable, will dismiss the idea of putting any effort whatsoever into the way they dress, with the eraser phrase of, well, whatever, I'm comfortable. Come on. Can't have it both ways. Now, you know, yes, I get that we're talking about emergency rescue gear on one hand and clothing on the other, but there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance there. It is an acceptance that the idea of comfort matters to some degree at various levels, depending on what we're talking about. And it's a matter of finding the appropriate balance. And that's why I want to kind of amplify the idea that, no, carrying a gun is never going to be as comfortable as not carrying a gun. It's not a realistic expectation. However, that's not to say that carrying a gun has to be such an imposition into your lifestyle that it requires that you overhaul and reinvent everything. It is absolutely entirely possible for you to incorporate a serviceable and appropriate firearm into your current wardrobe and current lifestyle, barring very limited exception. Unless you're, you know, a Hawaiian Tropics bikini model or a Chippendale dancer, we can probably make it work. So that's what I want to just kind of touch on and leave you guys with, is that if you find yourself in these exchanges, whether they be online or whether they be in person, make sure that the quips and the talking points are convenient, because you can always just kind of have them on deck to spit out whenever the opportunity arises, but understand the limitations that you can be creating when you do that, because it ain't that simple. We all know that. This is an ever-evolving process. The way that I carry now is so far removed from the way that I carried even a couple of years ago, and that is even before we start talking about the introduction of stuff like the Philster Enigma, which honestly has completely just shifted everything that I do in terms of carry, and I'm going to be doing an update on that shortly because I've been running it for about 8 months now. So it's just food for thought. I'm not trying to bag on anybody. I just want people to understand the impact that the language that they use has, especially given that if you are talking to somebody who has come to you with this, they're coming to you because you're speaking from some position of authority, because you have more exposure and more experience in this arena than they do. And so the goal is to foster this atmosphere of learning and open dialogue instead of, nah, fuck you, do it this way or don't bother. I don't like that. So, yeah, that's my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think. You know, I know that sometimes these can be a little bit sticky because, again, some of the folks that I ran these thoughts by were pretty adamant that no, a gun should be comforting, not comfortable. And the other side of that equation that we have to acknowledge is you got to be honest with yourself. Is it truly something that you're dealing with in terms of ergonomically viable, or are you just being lazy? Because yeah, it is a whole lot easier for me to just huck that 32 in my pocket and roll out for the day than it is to, you know, load up and the elaborate series of trusses that is the Enigma. It's not that elaborate. I'm just curious as to who's going to get that reference. So there is no singular right answer here. The smaller guns are not necessarily going to be as capable as the bigger guns by any stretch. But you got to also figure, what are you preparing for? I don't want to get too deep into that tangent because there's plenty of folks far more capable than myself that have really dug into this. The one that I think, the two that are top of mind are Daryl Bulkey, and he's had a couple podcast appearances that I will link to down in the description as well, and also John Johnston's most recent interview with Chuck Haggart, specifically as it pertains to weapon lights, but they touch on a lot of the same stuff. And so it's just a matter of making sure that the gear that you're selecting is conducive to your lifestyle and just being honest with yourself. So yeah, let me know what you think. If I'm completely off base, put it down in the comments. And if you think that this is something that resonates with you, I'd love to hear that as well. If you haven't joined already, we've got a lot of great discussion going on in the Facebook group, Bespoke Solutions. And as I mentioned as well, my Patreon is live. I'd really appreciate if you guys signed up. I appreciate the support. And aside from that, give the video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I hope everybody has a great week. Stay safe and stay sharp.